What's up, everybody? Hope you're all doing well. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Sequential Prophet 6 synth and do a deep dive into the new vintage knob behavior. The vintage knob is a great advancement that Sequential first released with the Prophet 5 Rev 4, and then they graciously ported it over to the Prophet 6 and the OB6 as well. The vintage knob behavior I'm particularly interested in because over the past few years, I've been doing voice component modeling. I've been researching this topic of per voice variance for the past couple of years, and have done a ton of testing on a bunch of old vintage synths like CS80s and Memory Moogs and Prophets and Jupiters and all the others, as well as many modern synths as well. And I've been really interested to know exactly how Sequential implemented the vintage knob and if it was similar. And so that was just the icing on the cake for me wanting to get the Prophet 6 and jump in and check it out. So the vintage knob, my general take overall is that it's a very good implementation. They are using curated, stable per voice offsets, which is the exact same type of approach that I've been advocating for over the past couple years with voice component modeling. So I'm glad to see that it's not based on randomness or random number generators or sample and hold LFO type of algorithms, and it's not based on artificial drifting motion like oscillator slop or drift or parameter drift type of algorithms. So it definitely appears to be generated from a curated table of stored offsets. And this methodology results in the best vintage character. And this is what I measured in all of the vintage synths that I tested and recorded and analyzed. So I'm really glad they went this route. With this method, you don't get extra artificial drifting motion, which is unrealistic in classic vintage synths, also unrealistic in acoustic ensembles if you're trying to model acoustic ensembles. It results in less dissonance than using random type of methods. With random methods, you get random moments where you get extreme dissonance. And also, it's repeatable from voice to voice as voices cycle through and from session to session. So once you save a patch, you can come back to it another time and you're going to get the same sort of vintagey behavior. So yeah, the methodology of the vintage knob is spot on. I'm really stoked to see Sequential's moved in this direction. And I think this is going to be a huge advancement moving forward as this type of algorithm and this type of per voice variance is further refined. So what I did with the Prophet 6 to measure the vintage knob is I measured the per voice variance on several different properties. And these tests are something that anyone can do. You know, I didn't hack into the firmware or anything. I'm just using over-the-counter oscilloscope, tuner, a spectrograph, and a stopwatch to do these tests. So anyone could do these tests at home with basic tools. I did testing on oscillator 1 and 2 tuning per voice, on the filter attack, decay, release, the filter cutoff, and filter resonance as well, actually. And I just measured all of the measurements on a per voice basis at maximum values and in between. And then I made some notes on the maximum values and have some recommendations actually too. So based on the past few years that I've been researching voice variance and doing voice modeling, I think actually the vintage knob behavior could actually be greatly improved by making some adjustments just to the value ranges. So the methodology of how it's implemented is perfect in my eyes. The stable, curated per voice offsets, that's the way to go. Just the maximum values that are set for some of these parameters, I think, could use some adjustments. So as is, the value range of oscillator 1 and 2 tunings is very good and within the range of classic synths that I tested. However, the offsets to the filter ADR timing, the envelope timing, and the filter cutoff, those offsets are extremely high. They're a bit too aggressive and result in some weird dissonant sounds and some behavior that I just don't think is what the vintage knob should be. My interpretation is the vintage knob should go from 0 to maximum, and at maximum value, it should have a ton of character. It should act like an old Memory Moog or old Prophet synth with a ton of character, a ton of per voice variance, but still have some musicality to it. As is with the extremely high ADR offsets to the filter envelope and the extremely high cutoff offsets. I feel like it goes beyond the vintage synth with a lot of character and gets into the territory of this synth is broken and badly in the need of servicing. And so my feeling is that just by toning down the values, you can make the vintage knob much more usable all the way up to maximum, and all the in-between values would be more tuned and sound better as well, and not sound like a synth that's in desperate need for getting into the shop like a broken synth, because really who wants that sort of sound anyway? For patches that have little or no resonance, or the filter timing is super quick, minimal attack, minimal decay, minimal release, you may not notice that these extreme values are there, and you can actually dial up the vintage knob all the way towards max or 3/4 or whatever, and it still sounds interesting and good, because in that case you're really only hearing the oscillator offsets, which are actually good, and you're not really hearing that much of the filter cutoff or the ADR offset. So it sounds good in those cases, but whenever you're playing a patch where there's a medium to larger amount of resonance in it, or any patch that has any sort of significant ADR timing on the filter, anything over a couple seconds of timing on the attack, decay, release of the filter, you start getting these extreme temporal offsets that just make the patches sound really wonky and sound like you have a broken synth, basically. So let's jump into the details here. So I did many measurements on these over multiple sessions, multiple days, at multiple temperatures, both when it's medium heated up and waiting until it gets completely heated up, and also with both operating system 1.66 and the new 1.67 official version. So I feel very confident in the values that have been reported back here, that these are accurate and that anyone would get these same values. So starting with oscillator tuning, this is oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 and voice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here's voice 1, voice 2, voice 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So here I have just an initialized patch. And if you see down in the tuner, down here, every time I hit it, it's basically perfectly in tune. So the tuning on the Prophet 6 is excellent once it's fully heated up, and given that you've had enough tuning table indexes set, you've calibrated enough times, it remembers the tuning, keeps tuning very well. So in this case, it's very good. It's within a cent, actually, on all 6 voices. Okay, so now I'm going to turn up the slot, or the vintage knob, rather, to maximum setting here, and hit one of these here. Okay, so now we have -6 cents right here. So I can tell you already, I know what voice we're on. We're on this voice right here, on voice 3 with -6. And I can tell you already, when I hit the key again, it's going to be +12. There you go, +12. It's going to be -12 next, around there. And now it's going to be way up there at +18 or so. And now it's going to be perfectly tuned. And now +6 cents and -6, and so on and so forth. So it's just going to continue to cycle through these voices with these exact same offsets per voice for oscillator 1. Now if we switch to oscillator 2, here I'm going to hit, this is oscillator 1 still at -12, so I know we're on this one, voice 5 right here. I'm going to just turn down oscillator 1 and turn up oscillator 2. And we have the same thing here, we're +12 cents sharp if compared to when I hit off. We got +12, or -12 rather. Or rather, the last one was +12, so here's -12. +18 with the offset in there, perfectly tuned, +6. This one is this one's an interesting one in that, let me turn this down a little. If I turn down vintage on this one, we're going to go to -1 cent basically. If I turn it all the way up, we got -9 cents. So in this one, we have a -8 cent difference, which is interesting in that every other one of these voices, the oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 have the exact same offsets, but in this case on voice 3, it's -8 compared to -6 cents flat on voice 3. And actually, this is good for the case that I'm going to make for recommendation for altering these values. It probably just means that these values are all stored on a per oscillator basis, per voice basis, probably in a table just like I'm showing here of 12 total values. So my recommendations for changing this are, well, first of all, the total range is very good. This is pretty much ideal in my eyes for a maximum value. This is what I measured when I measured some old memory Moogs, had very similar offsets like this, having a plus 18 cent difference from nominal or a negative 12 cent difference. That's very realistic for a vintage early 80s polysynth, VCO polysynth like this with a lot of character. So the total value range is good, but my recommendations here are twofold. So first off, I would recommend to slightly offset oscillator 1 from oscillator 2, like it's done in voice 3 here actually currently. But this is a more realistic vintagey type of character, having a separate offset for oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, where they're not exactly in parity in their per voice offsets. This is what I measured on many synths, and this is how I've been doing voice modeling over the past few years. So I'd recommend just making small differences on a per voice basis between oscillator 1 and 2. The second thing I'm recommending here is just to shuffle up the more extreme offsets. So the way it is right now is the smallest offsets are grouped in voice 1 and voice 2. You've got a delta or a difference of just 6 cents between voice 1 and voice 2. But if you compare voice 5 and voice 6, you've got negative 12 to plus 18. You've got a 30 cent difference between these two. So the delta or the difference between voice 5 and 6 is very extreme, whereas this one's very mild. And the reason why this is important is because the Prophet 6, of course, operates in a round robin voice allocation where it's always going voice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that. So what this results in is that if you're playing a 2 or 3 note chords, you're always going to get a situation where the most extreme offsets are grouped together, and then you're going to get the most mild offsets grouped together, just that they're one voice apart. So by just shuffling up these values, what I did here is I just moved the voice 6 plus 18 cents over here into the voice 2 position. Just shuffling up these values a bit like this and in a table like this will remove that issue of the grouping of the voices in the round robin structure, getting the more extreme deltas grouped together and the less extreme ones. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, the adjusting the offsets between oscillator 1 and 2 will just further increase the realism of the vintage behavior. So yeah, that's my sort of overview of the oscillator tuning offsets. Again, the general methodology and the max values are very good, but I think just making these minor changes can improve the vintage knob even further. And my hope or my expectation is that it's probably just a trivial task to make this switch if it's just a table of 12 values like this stored somewhere in the synth, to just quickly adjust the value of 12 values and boom, there you got it. Okay, let's jump on to envelope. So the filter envelope, the attack, decay, release times. I'm really just going to focus on the attack because the same things that I'm going to be talking about apply to decay and release as well. So my impression of the per voice variance to attack is that it's the right methodology again, but the issue is that there's just very high variance to the attack, decay, and release timings, the temporal offsets. It's too aggressive of an offset set for the per voice variance. So I measured this for attack at 4 different timings. So here's 4.3 seconds at 12.5 seconds nominal, at 18 seconds nominal, and at 22 seconds nominal. And if you look at each of the voices here, you'll see what the offsets are on a per voice basis. Again, I tested this multiple times, so I'm confident that this is accurate data. The issue we have here is, again, the more extreme examples here. Voice 6, we've got plus 1.6 seconds added on voice 6 and minus 1.2 seconds added on voice 5 when the nominal is only 4.3 seconds. So that's a very big difference, a 1.6 second difference when you're expecting to get a 4.3 second attack time with all the voices being equal, and you have that much of a variance. That is very extreme and results in some pretty wonky sounds, and it makes it pretty much unusable at higher values. It becomes even more extreme once you get up into these higher filter attack times. So once you get up into the 18-second filter attack, when you have the knob up 90% or so, You've got voice 5, between voice 5 and voice 6, you've got a negative 4-second almost differentiation on voice 5 and plus 4 seconds from nominal on voice 6. So you've got a delta, the difference between voice 5 and voice 6 of about 8 seconds difference temporally. And that's a huge amount. And if I were to ever encounter that in a vintage or modern synth, I would be bringing that in immediately for repair. That's beyond being just interesting vintage character or lots of vintage character, and that's in the category, to me at least, of a broken synth and a synth needing servicing on the envelope circuitry. So let me just bring up this patch here just to show this real quick. So watch the resonant peaks in the spectral graph here. So this is with vintage off. So you're going to see the spectral graph here. All the resonant peaks are rising right now, and now all falling together. So if I turn up, okay, and so here's with the vintage knob at maximum. So we'll watch the resonant peaks here, and we'll just count how many seconds it is from when the first resonant peak hits the top and falls down to the last one. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009. 9 seconds there. So that's a very extreme example. If you have a 9-second variance in your attack timing, that's too much in my eyes. That's in the territory of a broken synth with bad envelopes that needs to be serviced. If your target is for them to all be timed together and there's a 9-second approximate difference between the timing of when they reach their maximum attack stage and fall down. So this has an issue on many patches. It creates a sort of just a wonky sound. It varies how much you hear it depending on how much resonance is in the patch, whether or not key tracking is on, but it definitely creates a lot of weird sort of dissonance and wonkiness to patches. And my take on it is just the methodology and the idea is right, but that the maximum value just needs to be scaled down. And what I've marked down here is my recommendation would be to just divide the max value by 2 or divide by 3 possibly. You still will get a huge amount of vintage voice behavior. You still get a multiple second difference. In the example that I just showed, instead of a 8 or 9 second difference between attack times, you still get 4 to 5 seconds maybe. But 4 to 5 seconds is plenty of variance for tons of vintage behavior while sounding a little less crazy and wonky. So the other things I mentioned on this for recommendations, again, just the voice shuffling so that the highest and lowest delta or the highest and lowest difference are not grouped together in voice 5 and voice 6. It just creates that same issue with the round robin voice allocation that when you're playing a 2 or 3 note chord, you're always going to get the 2 most extreme ones together and then the 2 least extreme ones together. Whereas if you just shuffle up these values a little bit, it'll make it so you still have the same overall variance, but it's more distributed among the voices. And then the last thing, I didn't mention this. So these values in blue here, this is another issue with the attack, decay, release timings, is that these values in blue are essentially clipping as far as I can tell. And probably the math within the vintage knob wants to push these values higher, but they're clipping at the maximum attack time of 22 seconds. And so what actually happens here is that if you're using a long attack time, like the 22 second, if you have the attack at max, you're trying to make a long evolving pad type of sound, for instance, the values for voice 2, voice 4, and voice 6 are all clipping at 22 seconds, plus voice 1 doesn't have an offset. So what's essentially happening if you're creating a pad type of sound like this is you're getting 4 voices with no voice variance at all, and then only 2 voices are actually getting voice variance. So you're missing out on a lot of the voice variance character if you want to have that in a patch with a longer attack sound. Even it's an 18-second attack, if it's dialed back, you still get clipping somewhat. So the issue here is just that since it's using bidirectional negative and positive additions for the envelope timings, it creates that positive clipping issue. If possible, adjust it to be only negative offsets to attack time and decay time. That would be what I'd recommend. That's what I do in my voice modeling patches, is I have it always negatively modulating the attack times so that it doesn't clip like this. And so you always get some voice variance per voice, even at maximum value. So yeah, I think, you know, these three items, if they could be all dealt with, it would greatly increase the playability of the vintage knob and the usability of it all the way up to maximum value. The biggest thing being just to divide the maximum temporal offset so it's not so extreme and you don't get those 8-second differences. So for the decay, I'm not going to go into decay because it's the exact same issues as attack. Again, you have extremely high delta of 8-second difference here between voice 5 and voice 6. It actually even gets higher in the decay section. There's another test I did where it was even higher than that. So yeah, for decay and release, this the same thing applies. Just I think divide down and make it not so extreme for the ADR offsets, and we'll still get a ton of vintage character at maximum value, as much as you would ever want, and probably more than most people are ever going to use. I would imagine you'll still dial back the vintage knob for the majority of patches, but it will at least be more usable. Okay, and this is the last real focus point I want to jump into here, is the filter cutoff per voice variance. And this, again, it's the same issue. Is the methodology of how it's implemented is great, but I just think the value ranges or the max values are just way too high in this case. So this is the voice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like before, and these are the offsets from nominal. The issue here is that these values are just extreme. You've got, on voice 5, you've got a negative 100 cent flat variance, and voice 6, you've got a plus 220 cent or so positive variance. So you're talking a full semitone flat on voice 5 and over 2 semitones sharp on voice 6 every time it comes around. The total delta between these two is over 3 semitones. And that's just results in so much dissonance and weird sound in patches, especially if you have any sort of resonance going on, or if it's a patch where the filter key tracking is tracking a point above the oscillators, or many other cases. I feel like this is really a limiting factor on the usefulness of the vintage knob, because you get all this weird dissonance. Here, let me load this patch real quick. Okay, so this is just a self-oscillating filter. This is just for example here, so I could show the dissonance. So I'm just playing roots and fives, or 1, 3, 5 here. So that all sounds good as is. It's a little flat. That's a separate issue. If I turn up the vintage knob to max here, though, listen to it now. So that is completely unusable in my eyes. There's so much dissonance in that that you would never, you never get away with that. That's a broken synth in my eyes. If I had my synth and it had that much per voice variance to the filter tuning, I would be returning it to the manufacturer or bringing it into the shop for servicing immediately. Having a negative 100% or 1 semitone, that's a minor second or a major second offset. When you're playing a chord like this, a 1, 3, 5, you're getting like tritone type of tones and minor seconds and all kinds of weirdness in there. So this example with the self-oscillating filter just illustrates it very clearly, but you still hear the same thing in any patch where you have any sort of resonance in it, or using the filter key tracking, or even without, you get just these weird dissonances in there because the filter offsets are so extreme and so weird. So my recommendation on this is to really cut this down by a lot, like divide by 5 or so is what I'd recommend. So if you have, 220 or 240 max right now, divide that by 5 and you've got still a huge offset, like 45 cents offsets, which still has a ton of vintage character. If you have a 45 cent offset positive and then another voice with a 25 cent negative, you still got, 70 cents total delta there of filter offsets. That's still a ton of vintage character built into the filter offsets on a per voice basis when you have it dialed up at max, and it's going to give you that feeling of a old vintage synth that's not tuned very well, but it's not going to go into the territory of being just a completely broken synth or a synth that's badly in need of tuning. So I feel like, you know, dividing these by 5 would easily solve that and would still give you plenty of vintage behavior up at maximum, and just make it so the vintage knob all the way through from 0 to full is going to be much more usable and interesting. And again, the other thing here is just shuffling up, like I mentioned on the oscillator and the envelope, shuffling up the more extreme values so they're not grouped together, voice 5, voice 6, versus the lowest values, voice 1 and voice 2. So yeah, that's pretty much wraps up the items that I have for, you know, for recommendations for making adjustments. I'm hoping that if Sequential is willing to consider these and make these changes, I'm expecting they're probably trivial things to change. I'm guessing that there's just a table in the synth, just like this, for filter cutoff of 6 values like this that represent the max values, and the same for the attack timing and decay timing and oscillator 1 and 2 values. I'm guessing it would just be a matter of literally going in and adjusting 6 values here, and then resaving the firmware out to adjust this. And I hope it will be considered, because I really think the vintage knob is an awesome improvement over Slop and previous generation voice offsets. It's the right direction to go, and I'm really excited for the future of it. And I just feel like this will greatly improve very quickly the implementation of the vintage knob in its current form, and just make it much more usable all the way through the knob dial. So I did look at some other parameters. I did notice that the amp doesn't have attack decay release offsets, which I think is fine. That's a lower priority thing anyway. Basically, with the vintage knob, all of the highest priority elements that I always target on my voice modeling patches are hit. You know, oscillator tuning 1, 2, the envelope, filter, attack, decay, release, and the cutoff. Those are the highest priority things in my eyes, and they've all been hit in this vintage knob algorithm. So I think that's excellent. You know, the slop and oscillator drift, it's not a good approximation of vintage voice variance. The exaggerated detuning motion is a very artificial type of motion, something that you don't see oscillator values moving constantly. You know, you'll see a teeny bit of movement of a fraction of a cent over the period of playing a song maybe, but nothing like Slop was previously. So I'm glad that, you know, this is moving on from Slop, and I really think Slop and oscillator drift type of circuits can be left in the dust as this type of per voice variance is implemented. And yeah, I'm really excited, not just for this current implementation, but also for the future of this. You know, I've written up a ton of information on the voice component modeling websites, just going over my thoughts for the future of voice modeling, and how there could be multiple different sort of voice profiles stored within an instrument that model various different synths and or acoustic ensemble type of instruments, because this type of voice offsetting is perfect for modeling acoustic ensembles as well. If you're trying to model orchestral strings or brass or choirs or a variety of different acoustic type of instruments, strings or pluck instruments, it greatly improves the realism. So yeah, I think I'll wrap up the video at that. It's awesome. Sequential has moved in this direction. I'm really stoked to have the vintage knob, and very excited about the Prophet 6 as well. And have a lot of fun with this synth, I think. So subscribe if you've enjoyed this and want to see more videos like this. I have tons of other videos on synthesizer sound design, and some more advanced topics like this. And make sure to comment and like if you have any questions or comments. All right, have a good one. Bye.